The notice had been hanging in the window of the Miller's Bend Mercantile for 3 months, gone yellow at the edges, and every cook in the county had read it and laughed. Wanted, it said, in a man's blunt hand. Woman to cook and keep house for a widower and 5 boys. Wages fair, hard work, no fools. And underneath that, added later in different ink. As though the man had grown desperate enough to beg, the words, "They are good boys. They are only hungry." Della Mercer stood in front of that window on a gray morning in the spring of 1886 and read the notice twice. And she did not laugh. She was 34 years old and down to her last $11, and she had been turned away from 3 kitchens that season for no reason anyone would say out loud, but that every one of them meant plainly enough. She was too big. A cook was supposed to be a comfort to look at. Plump, maybe, but jolly plump, storybook plump, not this. Not a woman who filled a doorway and had to turn sideways to pass between the stove and the table. She had heard it her whole life, in words and in the absence of words, and she had stopped expecting anything different from anyone. But a man with 5 hungry boys, a man desperate enough to write they are only hungry on a public notice where the whole town could see him beg. That was a man who might not have the luxury of caring what his cook looked like. If you have ever been passed over for the shape of you instead of the substance of you, if you have ever stood in front of a door you were sure would close in your face and made yourself knock anyway because you had run clean out of other doors, then stay with me a while. This is a story about a woman nobody wanted, and a house full of motherless boys who were starving for more than supper, and the plain, hard truth that sometimes the person the whole world overlooks is the exact person a broken family has been praying for without knowing how to ask. Stay with Della to the end of this one. And when you get there, do me a kindness and tell me in the comments what town you're listening from tonight, because I like to know how far these stories travel. Now, let me take you up the long road to the Ford Ranch, 6 miles out from Miller's Bend, Montana, where a widower and 5 wild half-starved boys were about to have their lives changed by a heavyset woman with $11 and nowhere else to go. She spent 4 of her $11 on the ride out, and the man who drove her, a garrulous old teamster named Pete Sorley, who hauled freight to the outlying ranches, talked the whole way, and most of what he talked about was the Ford place. "Now I don't like to speak ill," he said, which is the thing people say right before they speak ill, but you ought to know what you're getting into, ma'am, before you're too far up that road to walk back. Silas Ford's a good man, was a good man, best hand with cattle in the valley and honest as the day. But he lost his Clara 5 years back, bringing the littlest one into the world, and something in him just went out, like a lamp. He keeps the ranch going, barely, and he keeps those boys fed, barely, and that's all he does. 5 boys, ma'am, and no woman in that house since Clara passed, and do you know what 5 boys with no mother turn into? Wolves. Sweet wolves, maybe, underneath, but wolves. 3 cooks he's hired since winter. 3, the first one lasted a week. The last one lasted 2 days and walked the whole 6 miles back to town on foot rather than wait for me to fetch her. He glanced sideways at Della, at the size of her, and she saw him think better of whatever he'd been about to say. Well, he finished. "I just hope you're made of stern stuff, is all. I'm made of exactly the stuff the good Lord saw fit to make me of," Della said mildly, "and I've found it holds up to most weather." And she watched the country roll by, hard and green and enormous, under a sky that went on forever, and she felt the old familiar fear sitting in her stomach, the fear of arriving somewhere new and being found wanting. And she breathed around it the way she had learned to, and she did not let it show on her face. The Ford ranch, when it came into view, told her everything old Pete had been too kind to say plainly. It had been a fine place once. You could see the bones of it, the good solid house, the big barn, the well-built corrals. But it had the look now of a thing sliding slowly toward ruin. Not fast, not all at once, but the steady way a place goes when there is no one in it with a heart left to tend the small things. A shutter hung crooked. The garden was a square of weeds. Chickens ran loose and unfenced, and a rail was down in the corral and had been down long enough that the horses had learned to step over it. And in the yard, as the wagon rattled up, Della saw the boys. There were 5 of them, and Pete had been right. They were half wild. The littlest one, no more than 5, was sitting in the dirt in a shirt gone gray and stiff with old dirt, gravely feeding pebbles to a chicken. 2 middle boys were up on the barn roof, of all places, doing something that made Della's heart stop until she saw they were only patching a hole, badly, with a board too short for the job. Another was chopping wood with a great deal more fury than skill. And the biggest one, a boy near grown, 15 or so, tall and raw-boned, and already wearing his father's grief on his young face like a coat too big for him, stood in the middle of the yard with his arms crossed and watched the wagon come with an expression that was not welcome, that was the exact opposite of welcome, that was a door already closing. Silas Ford came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a tall man, lean the way a man gets who has stopped caring whether he eats, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and a face that must have been handsome before sorrow rearranged it. He looked to be somewhere in his 40s, and he looked, Della thought, tired in a way that sleep does not fix, tired all the way to the bottom of himself. He came to the wagon, and he looked up at her, and she watched him do the arithmetic that men always did. Watched him take in the size of her, and she braced for the flicker of disappointment, the quick recalculation. It came, but it came differently than she was used to. In most men that flicker was about themselves, about what they'd hoped to get and hadn't. In this man it seemed to be about her. He looked at her, and something moved behind his tired eyes that she could not name. And it was only much later that she understood what it had been. It had been worry. He had looked at a large, weary woman climbing down off a freight wagon, and his first thought had not been she is not pretty. His first thought had been, the boys will run her off like they ran off the others, and I have nothing left to offer that would make her stay, and I have already begged in the newspaper. And there is no lower left for me to go. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I'm Silas Ford. I'm obliged you came all this way. He hesitated, and then, because he was clearly a man who had lost the habit of softening things, he said it straight out. I'll be honest with you, because you'll find it out by supper anyhow, and I'd rather you heard it from me. 3 women have quit this place since January. My boys are not bad boys, but they've been without a mother 5 years, and without much of a father either, if I'm truthful, and they've got no more idea how to treat a lady than those chickens do. If you want to climb back on that wagon, Pete'll take you to town, and I'll pay your fare both ways, and no hard feelings. I won't think less of you. Nobody could. Della looked at him, and then she looked past him at the 5 boys, who had all stopped what they were doing now, and were watching her with 5 pairs of wary eyes, the way a pack watches a stranger at the edge of its territory, and she saw past the wildness of them, because she had a particular gift for seeing past the surface of people, having spent her life praying somebody would see past hers. She saw that the littlest one had crept behind the biggest one's legs and was peering out. She saw that the wood-chopping boy had a burn healing badly on his forearm that no one had tended. She saw that all 5 of them were thin. Too thin. Thin in the way that is not natural for growing boys, and that under the dirt and the defiance they were, every one of them. Watching her the way hungry things watch a person carrying food with a wariness that was really only hope that had been disappointed too many times to show itself as hope anymore. "Mr. Ford," she said, and she gathered her skirts and climbed down off that wagon under her own power before he could offer her a hand she was too heavy to be helped down by. "I've cooked in a lumber camp for 40 men who hadn't seen a woman in 4 months and would have eaten the tablecloth if I'd salted it. I've cooked in a boarding house for railroad men who came in off a 12-hour shift meaner than snakes. 5 boys don't frighten me. Now, somebody's going to have to show me where the kitchen is. And then everybody's going to have to leave me alone in it for about 3 hours, and then we'll see what's what. That's how I work. I don't win people over with talk. I never had the gift for talk. I win them over with what comes out of the oven, and if that doesn't do it, nothing will, and you can put me back on the wagon with a clear conscience." She turned to the boys. "Which one of you knows where your mama kept her good flour, if there's any left?" It was the littlest one who answered her. The others held their silence, the big one especially, whose jaw was set hard against her, but the littlest boy, the 5-year-old, the one who had been feeding pebbles to the chicken, stepped out from behind his big brother's legs and said, in a piping voice, "Papa keeps it in the tin with the rooster on it, up high so the mice don't get it." And then, having delivered this intelligence, he looked stricken, as though he'd betrayed some family secret, and darted back behind his brother's legs. "The tin with the rooster on it," Della said, as gravely as if he'd handed her the key to a kingdom. "That's exactly the thing I needed to know. Thank you kindly, young sir. And what do they call you?" There was a silence. Then, muffled from behind the big brother, "Asa." "Asa," Della repeated. "That's a fine, strong name. It's a Bible name, you know. Asa was a king." And she saw the little boy's eyes go round at the notion that he shared a name with a king, and she saw, too, the big brother's hand come down, not roughly, and rest on the little one's head, half a warning and half a comfort, and she filed that away, because it told her the most important thing there was to know about this family. Whatever had gone wrong here, whatever had gone wild and hungry and hard, the big one was still looking after the little one. There was love in this house still. It had only gone to ground, the way love does when it has been hurt, burrowed down deep where nothing could get at it to hurt it again. And a love that has only gone to ground can be coaxed back up. It is the love that has died altogether you cannot do anything for, and Della had been in houses where the love had died altogether, and this was not one of them. This was a house holding its breath, and she knew how to make a house breathe again. She did it with an oven and a table and a great deal of stubborn patience, and she had come to precisely the right place to do it, though not one soul in that yard, least of all herself, yet knew it. The kitchen, when they showed it to her, was worse than she had feared, and she had feared a great deal. It was not merely dirty. It was defeated. The stove was caked with the burnt remains of 100 ruined meals. The dishes had been washed, if you could call it that, in cold water without soap, and stacked greasy. There was a smell of old grease and sour milk and something worse underneath. The flour in the rooster tin was half weevils. The single window was so grimed that the good spring light came through it gray and sickly. And on a shelf above the stove, where a woman would have kept her spices and her small treasures, there was a thick, furred layer of dust, and in the middle of the dust, wiped clean and dustless, a single spot the size of a picture frame, where something had once stood and had been taken down. Della looked at that clean spot in the dust and understood it completely. Someone had taken down the dead woman's picture because they could not bear to have her watching over a kitchen gone to ruin. And she thought, "We will have that picture back up before I am through here." A mother belongs in her kitchen, living or dead. But that was for later. First there was the flour to see to, and the stove, and 5 hungry boys, and 1 heartsick man, and a supper that had to be good enough to change everything, because Della had told them plainly that talk would not win them, and only the oven would. And now she had to make the oven keep her word. She sent Pete back to town with 2 of her 7 remaining dollars and a list, because there was nothing in that house worth cooking, and she would not be able to work her one miracle with weevily flour and rancid lard. Eggs she had from the loose chickens, and she had the boys gather them, turning it into a game for the little ones and a challenge for the older ones, sending them scrambling under porches and into the barn loft after the eggs those wild hens had hidden all over the place, and by the time they had done it, they had gathered near 3 dozen eggs, and, without quite noticing they were doing it, had begun to look at her a little differently, because she had set them a task and praised them for doing it, and it had been a long time since anyone had done either. All but the eldest. The eldest boy, whose name she learned was Levi, did not scramble after eggs. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and watched her with a hostility so pure and so deep that it could only be, she knew, the mask that a certain kind of grief wears, and she let him watch, and she did not push him, because she understood that this boy was going to be the hardest and the most important of all her work in that house, and that she had one chance to do it right and no chance to do it fast. She cleaned first. You cannot cook in a filthy kitchen, and more than that. Della had learned that the cleaning was itself part of the magic, that a family could smell the difference in a house scrubbed by someone who meant to stay. She heated water, and she scoured that stove down to honest black iron, with sand and lye and the strength of her 2 broad arms, and she scrubbed the table until the years of grease gave up and the good pine grain showed through. And she washed that grimed window inside and out until the spring light came pouring through it clean and gold and lay across the clean table like a benediction. It took her 2 hours, and she sweated through her dress doing it, and the boys drifted in one by one to watch, drawn by the strangeness of seeing their kitchen transformed, and even Levi. Though he kept his post in the doorway and his arms crossed, even Levi watched. And then she cooked. When Pete came back with the supplies she set to it, and she did not cook anything fancy, because fancy was not what these boys needed. She cooked the food of comfort, the food that says you are cared for, the deep old food that reaches into a person below the place where words can reach. She made chicken and dumplings her mother's recipe. The chicken stewed slow until it fell off the bone and the broth gone rich and golden, and the dumplings dropped in light as clouds and steamed until they were tender all the way through. She made a mountain of mashed potatoes with real butter melting down the sides of it. She made green beans cooked with a bit of bacon for the salt of it, and she made. Because there was time, and because children need sweetness, a great pan of cornbread with honey and a dried apple cobbler with a crust that shattered like something precious. The smells of it filled that house and rolled out the clean window and across the yard, and the boys, who had been scattered to their chores, began to drift back toward the house the way iron filings drift toward a loadstone, unable to help themselves, following their noses home. She set the table properly. She had found, in her cleaning, a stack of good plates put away in a cupboard, the everyday tin having been all that was used for years, and she got them down and washed them and set the table with them, 7 places, and she found a jar and put in it a fistful of the little wild blue flowers that grew along the porch, and she stood back and looked at that table, laden and steaming and set for a family, in a kitchen full of clean gold light. And she felt the thing she always felt at this moment, the moment before they came in and saw it, which was terror, plain terror, that it would not be enough, that she would not be enough, that they would sit down and eat and it would change nothing and she would be back on the wagon by morning. She had felt that terror 1,000 times. It never got easier. But she had learned to do the thing anyway, with the terror sitting right there beside her, and that, she had come to believe, was the whole of courage. Not the absence of the fear, but the doing of the thing regardless. She rang the triangle, and they came. They came in from the yard and the barn, all 5 of them, and Silas came in behind them, and they stopped, every one of them, just inside the door, and they stared at that table. Della watched their faces. She watched the little one, Asa, who could not have had many clear memories of a table like this, stare at it with his mouth actually open. She watched the middle boys go still with a kind of wonder. She watched Silas Ford look at his mother's good plates, at the wildflowers in the jar, at the steaming abundance of it. And she watched something move across his ruined, tired face that she thought might be the beginning of the breaking of something that had been frozen a long time. And she watched Levi, the eldest, the hostile one, stare at that table with his jaw working, and she understood, in a flash of insight that near broke her own heart, that Levi was the only one of them old enough to truly remember. That Levi could remember when his mother was alive and the table looked like this every night, and that what she had done in her innocence, in her wish to do a kindness, was to conjure up the ghost of everything he had lost and set it steaming on the table in front of him. "Well," she said, into that terrible wondering silence, gently, because she sensed the moment was as fragile as blown glass. "It's no good looking at it. Looking never filled anybody. Sit down and eat before it goes cold. There's plenty. There's more than plenty. Whatever you don't eat tonight, you'll eat cold for breakfast and be glad of it, but I've a notion there won't be much left. Sit down now, all of you. That chair, too." For Silas had stopped behind a chair at the head of the table and put his hand on the back of it and gone still, and Della understood without being told that it was his chair, that the one at the foot, the empty one she had set a place at out of habit and rightness, had been Clara's, and that no one had sat in either of them at a proper set table in 5 years. "Sit down, Misty Ford," she said, "softer. Your boys are hungry. A father sits at the head of his table. That's where you belong." And after a long moment, Silas Ford pulled out his chair, and he sat down at the head of his own table for the first time in 5 years, and he bowed his head. And in a voice gone so rough it was barely a voice at all, he said grace, and the boys sat, and they ate. Lord, how they ate. Della stood by the stove where a cook stands, and she watched 5 starving boys discover what supper was supposed to be, and it was one of the great sights of her life. The little ones ate with both hands, faces down close to their plates, making small sounds. The middle boys ate and held out their plates for more without a word, too intent to talk. Silas ate slowly, like a man who has forgotten how and is remembering, and twice she saw him stop with his fork halfway up and just breathe, as though the taste of chicken and dumplings had opened a door in him he'd nailed shut, and she looked away both times to give him the privacy of it. She kept the food coming. She filled the plates and refilled them and filled them a third time, and she watched the mountain of potatoes vanish, and the beans vanish, and the cornbread vanish, and she cut the cobbler, and the boys ate that too. And when it was all gone, when there was truly nothing left, the boys sat back in their chairs with their bellies round and full for the first time in longer than any of them could. Remember, and a kind of stunned, peaceful quiet settled over that kitchen, the deep animal contentment of the fed. And it was in that quiet that the youngest, Asa, the 5-year-old, did the thing that Della would remember on her deathbed. He climbed down from his chair, and he came around the table to where she stood by the stove, and he tugged on her apron, and when she bent down to him. This little boy, who had never really known a mother, who had been born into a house where the mothering had died with the woman who was supposed to do it, he put his 2 small arms as far around her broad middle as they would reach, and he pressed his face into her apron, and he said, in his piping little voice, muffled against her, "Are you going to stay? I want you to stay. You feel like a mama." And the whole kitchen went silent. Della's throat closed. She put her hand on the little boy's head, on his fine, dirty hair, and she could not speak for a moment, and in that moment she looked up and her eyes met Silas Ford's across the wreckage of the meal, and she saw that the man was weeping, silently, the tears just running down into his beard without his making any move to stop them or hide them. A man who had not wept in 5 years, weeping now at the sight of his motherless boy with his arms around a stranger, and she saw the eldest, Levi, shove back his chair and stand up so hard it fell over, and stride out of the house into the dark without a word, the screen door banging behind him. And she understood that this one supper had cracked open every frozen thing in that house all at once. The grief and the hunger and the love that had gone to ground, all of it breaking the surface in the same moment, and that nothing in the Ford house would ever be quite the same again, and that this exact moment was the reason she had been born a woman who could cook and could not do much else, was the reason for the whole long, lonely road that had brought her here. She had one gift, and she had just spent it, all at once, and it had been enough. For the first time in her whole life, it had been enough. "Yes," she said to Asa, when she could speak, and she said it looking at his father, and she said it like a vow. "Yes, I'm going to stay. As long as your papa will have me, I'm going to stay right here and cook your suppers and see you all grow up strong. I'm not going anywhere." And the little boy sighed against her, a great shuddering sigh of relief, and went boneless with trust in the way only a small child can, and she gathered him up, all warm and heavy and full of supper, and held him, and across the table Silas Ford wiped his face with the heel of his hand and said, "Horse, I'll have you. God knows I'll have you. Stay, and out in the dark," though none of them knew it yet. The eldest boy stood by the corral fence with his fists clenched and his jaw working, and wept his own tears where no one could see, because he was old enough to remember, and remembering was the cruelest thing of all. The weeks that followed were the busiest and, Della would later say, among the happiest of her life, though they did not feel happy at the time so much as they felt like war. The good kind of war, the kind you wage against dirt and chaos and neglect and slowly, inch by inch, win. She turned that household around the way you turn a heavy wagon, not all at once, but with steady pressure applied in the right direction for long enough. She cooked 3 real meals a day, and the boys began to feel out. The sharp, hungry edges of them softening into the sturdy roundness boys are meant to have. She scrubbed and mended and organized. She got the garden weeded and planted, the boys hauling water and pulling weeds under her direction, and by midsummer there were vegetables coming that had not come off that land in 5 years. She patched the boys' clothes, and then, when patching would no longer serve, cut down Silas's worn-out shirts into new ones for the older boys, and made the little ones' clothes from a bolt of cloth she talked Silas into buying on the next trip to town. She tended the wood-chopping boys' infected burn until it healed clean. She learned them, each one, the way you learn a garden, what each one needed and what each one feared. There was Wesley, the second-born 12 years old, who was clever and quick and had appointed himself the family clown, hiding his grief behind jokes, and who Della won by laughing at his jokes, truly laughing, because they were often truly funny, and by taking him seriously in the quiet moments when the clown mask slipped. There was Micah, 10, gentle and dreamy, who loved animals and was forever bringing home injured things, and who Della won by helping him nurse a broken winged hawk back to health in a box behind the stove instead of telling him to throw the useless thing out. There was Gideon, 8, fierce and quick to anger, who had the most of his eldest brothers hurt in him, and who Della won slowly, by never once meeting his anger with anger, by being a wall his fury could break against and find, to its surprise, that the wall did not break back and did not go away. And there was Asa, the baby, 5 years old, who was already hers, who had been hers from the moment he put his arms around her, and who followed her about the house all day long like a small warm shadow and cried if she went out of his sight, and whose fine dirty hair she washed, and whose scraped knees she kissed, and whose small hand found hers 100 times a day. And there was Levi, the eldest, 15 and near a man, who had held the whole family together with his own 2 hands and his own breaking heart through 5 years of his father's grief, who had cooked the burnt suppers and minded the little ones and done the work of a grown man since he was 10 years old, and who could not, would not, forgive Della Mercer for walking into his house and doing easily what he had been failing to do at such terrible cost for so long. He was polite to her, mostly in the flat, cold way his father had been polite the first day. He ate her food, because a boy of 15 cannot not eat, but he held himself apart from the warmth that was thawing the rest of them, held himself deliberately out in the cold, and Della understood why, and it near broke her heart, because she understood that Levi had made himself the keeper of his mother's memory, had decided somewhere in his grieving that if he loved Della, if he let himself be mothered by her, it would be a betrayal of the mother he had lost. That his mother would be truly gone the day her son stopped needing her, and so Levi would go on needing her, would go on grieving her, would keep the wound open by main force, because the wound was the last thing he had left of her and he would not let it heal. It was for Levi that Della did the thing with the picture. She had found it, in her cleaning, wrapped in a shirt in the bottom of a trunk. The framed photograph of a young woman with a sweet grave face and dark eyes that all 5 boys had. The picture that had been taken down from the clean spot in the dust above the stove. And one evening, without a word to anyone, she cleaned the glass of it, and she polished the frame, and she set it back up on the shelf above the stove, in the exact spot where the dust had never settled, so that Clara Ford looked out over her kitchen once again while the woman who had taken her place cooked at her stove. Della did not do it to please the boys or the man. She did it because it was right, because a mother belongs in her kitchen, because she wanted no part of a healing built on pretending Clara Ford had never lived. And when Levi came in to supper that night and saw his mother's face looking down at him from the shelf for the first time in 5 years, he stopped dead, and he stared at it. And then he turned and looked at Della. And for just one moment, before he got the cold mask back up, she saw the whole of his 15-year-old heart in his face, the grief and the longing and a terrible relief, and she knew that she had reached him, finally, not through his stomach, but through his mother, and that it was a beginning. It was only a beginning. But she had learned to be patient with beginnings. She gave Levi something else, too, in those weeks, something she gave him so quietly he did not at first understand he was being given anything at all. She gave him back his boyhood, a little of it, the boyhood that had been taken from him at 10 years old when he became the man of a motherless house. She noticed how he did it, how he rose before anyone to lay the fire, how his eyes went always to the little ones to count them and check them, how he carried the whole family on his young shoulders out of a habit 5 years deep. And she began, gently, without ever saying a word about it, to take the weight back off him. She was up before him now to lay the fire, so that when he came down, it was already lit. And she watched him stand confused in front of the warm stove the first few mornings, a boy who had forgotten what it was to come down to a fire someone else had made. She took over the minding of the little ones, the 1,000 small watchings and worryings of them, and she watched Levi's shoulders come down from around his ears by slow degrees as he understood, day after day, that he did not have to hold it all anymore, that someone else was holding it now, someone strong enough to hold it, and that he was allowed to set it down. One evening she found him out at the corral in the last light, just standing, watching the horses, doing nothing, and she understood what a rare thing that was, Levi Ford doing nothing, and she brought him a slab of cake and stood beside him at the rail and did not talk, only let him be, and after a while the boy said, not looking at her, "I used to want to run away. When it was bad, when they were all crying and there wasn't enough food and Papa was just gone. Even when he was standing right there, he was gone. I used to stand right here and think about just walking off down that road and never coming back." He took a breath. "I never told anybody that. I felt bad for it every day, wanting to leave them." And Della, who knew that a confession like that must be received exactly right or it will never come again, said, "Easy," still watching the horses. "Course you did. You were a boy doing a grown man's job with no help and no thanks. Any soul alive would have wanted to run from that. Wanting to run isn't the same as running. You never ran. You stayed, and you held them when you were too little to have to. That's not something to feel bad about, Levi. That's about the finest thing I ever heard of a person doing. She let that sit a moment. But you don't have to hold them alone anymore. That's mine now, that job. You can just be 15 for a while. You've earned it about 10 times over. And Levi Ford stood at the corral rail in the dusk and ate his cake and said nothing more, but Della saw him wipe his eyes once with the back of his wrist when he thought she wasn't looking, and after that night, though he still kept his careful distance and his cold politeness for a good while yet, there was something underneath it that had gone soft, some knot that had loosened. And she knew that when the day came that Levi Ford finally let himself love her, it would be a love as deep and as fierce and as loyal as the burden he had carried, because it is always the ones who have loved hardest under the hardest circumstances who love best once they are finally free to. It was during those thawing weeks that Della and Silas began. Without either of them naming it, or perhaps even noticing it at first, to become something to each other beyond the woman who cooked and the man who paid her. It happened in the evenings, mostly after the boys were abed, in the half hour or so before Della retired to her little room off the kitchen. Silas had taken to lingering. He would come in from the last of the chores and find her sitting by the stove with her mending, and instead of going straight to his own bed as a tired man might, he would pour himself a cup of the coffee she kept warm for him and sit down across the kitchen, and they would talk, low, so as not to wake the boys, or more often they would not talk at all. Only sit in the companionable quiet of two people at the end of a long day of good work. He was not a talking man. She was not a talking woman. But there is a kind of closeness that grows in silence between two people who are comfortable in it, and it grew between them, in that clean, warm kitchen, night after night, under the picture of his first wife that his second had hung back up with her own hands. He told her things in those evenings that she suspected he had never told another living soul. He told her about Clara a little at a time, not the grief of losing her, but the small, good, ordinary memories of having her. The way she'd sung off key, the way she'd loved a particular yellow flower, the joke she'd made the day Levi was born. And Della understood that this was a great gift he was giving her, that a man does not speak of his dead wife to the woman replacing her unless he trusts that woman entirely, unless he knows she is large enough of heart not to be jealous of a ghost, and Della was large enough. She listened to every word about Clara Ford with nothing but tenderness, and asked gentle questions, and let the man grieve out loud in his own halting way, and never once let him see anything but that his memories were safe with her. It was, though neither of them knew it, the truest courtship in the world, that sharing of the dead across a kitchen table, for a woman who will hold your grief gently, will hold everything else gently too. And she told him things in turn. She told him about her own life, the hard-scrabbled girlhood, the father who'd made her feel a burden, the young husband dead of a mill accident inside 2 years of marriage and no children come of it, the long parade of kitchens after that, the boarding houses and lumber camps and other people's weddings, the slow hardening of her heart against a hope that never came to anything. She had never told anyone the whole of it. She had never had anyone who wanted to hear it. And Silas Ford sat across the kitchen and heard the whole of it, and at the end of it he said, in his plain, rough way, "The world's been a fool about you, Della Mercer. Your whole life the world's been a plain fool." And it was not a pretty speech, and it was worth more to her than all the pretty speeches ever made, because she knew he meant it, and because no one had ever in her life looked at the shape of her hurt instead of the shape of her body and called it what it was, which was the world's foolishness and not her own failing. There was a night in early summer she never forgot. A storm had come up, one of those sudden violent mountain storms, and the thunder had frightened little Asa, and Della had brought him down to the kitchen and rocked him by the warm stove until he slept, and Silas had come in soaked from seeing to the panicked horses, and the two of them had sat there in the stormlight, the sleeping child between them, and something in the closeness of it. The child, the storm, the warm, safe kitchen against the wild night had made Silas reach across and lay his rough hand over Della's broad one where it rested on the sleeping boy, and he had not said anything, and she had not said anything, and they had sat like that, hands touching, a long while the thunder rolled away down the valley. And it was the first time a man had touched Della Mercer with tenderness in more years than she cared to count, and she had to bite down hard on the inside of her cheek to keep from weeping at the sweetness of it. Neither of them spoke of it after, but his hand found hers again other evenings, and hers did not pull away. And the thing between them deepened and set like something poured warm that slowly takes its shape, and by the time Adeline Cobb came to try to break it, it had grown roots far deeper than either Della or Silas had yet admitted out loud. The matter of Gideon came to its head around the same time, and it showed Della and showed Silas watching what manner of woman had come into their house. Gideon was 8, the 4th son, and he carried more raw anger in his small body than the other 4 put together. A hot, quick fury that came from nowhere and sent him into rages, throwing things, striking his brothers, screaming until he was hoarse. The other cooks had been frightened of him. Silas, at the end of his own rope, had mostly just endured him. But Della understood Gideon, because Della understood that a child's rage is almost always grief that has found no other door, and Gideon had been 3 when his mother died, old enough to lose her and too young to understand it, and the loss had lodged in him as a fury he had no words for. So when Gideon threw his tantrum at Della, as she had known he eventually would, when he swept his supper plate off the table one night and screamed that she wasn't his mother and he hated her and she should go away and die, Della did not scold him and did not strike him and did not, as the other women had, dissolve into frightened tears. She got down on the floor, her bulk making it slow, and she gathered the raging, screaming boy into her arms, and she held him. Held him firm and safe while he kicked and struck at her and screamed the ugliest things his little heart could find, held him the way you hold a pot that is boiling over, not to stop the boil, but to keep it from spilling somewhere it would burn, and she said over and over into his hair the same thing, low and steady, I know. You're allowed to be this mad. I've got you. I'm not going anywhere. You're allowed. And the boy, who had been braced his whole short life for the world to meet his fury with fury, to be struck or shamed or sent away for it, found instead that this large, calm woman simply absorbed it, took the whole boiling force of his grief and held it and did not break and did not leave. And something in Gideon that had been wound tight as a watch spring for 5 years finally let go. The screaming turned to sobbing, the striking turned to clinging, and Gideon Ford wept in Della's arms for the mother he had been too young to properly remember and too young to properly mourn, wept himself limp and empty and clean, and when it was over he was so exhausted she had to carry him up to bed, and he slept 12 hours, and he woke a gentler boy than he had been, as though the poison had finally been drawn. Silas had watched the whole of it from the doorway, unmoving, and when Della came down from putting the boy to bed, she found the man with tears on his face, and he said, wonderingly, "How did you know to do that?" "I've been trying to break that temper out of him for 5 years." And Della said, "You don't break it, Silas. That's the whole trouble. Everybody's been trying to break it. You don't break a grief. You just hold it till it's done." That boy wasn't bad. That boy was drowning, and nobody'd got in the water with him. And Silas Ford looked at his wife-to-be, though he did not yet know that was what she was, and understood that he was in the presence of a wisdom about the human heart that all his hard years had never taught him. And he loved her in that moment so much it frightened him, which was the beginning, though he did not know it, of all the fear that Adeline Cobb would so nearly turn against them both. The trouble, when it came from town, and it came wearing black silk and driving a fine buggy, and its name was Mrs. Adeline Cobb. She was Clara's mother, the boy's grandmother, a widow of some means who lived in a tall house in Miller's Bend, and who had, Della gathered from the careful way the boys spoke of her, been a fixed and formidable star in the family sky for as long as any of them could remember. She had disapproved of Silas from the start, disapproved of her genteel daughter marrying a rough rancher and going out to live on the raw edge of the country, and when Clara died out there, bringing her 5th grandson into the world, Adeline Cobb had never once let Silas forget that she blamed him for it, that in her heart she believed her daughter would be alive still if she had married some soft-handed town man who kept her safe in a parlor. She came out to the ranch every few weeks to inspect it, and to remind Silas of his failures, and to press upon him her long-held conviction that the boys, or at least the younger ones, ought to come and live with her in town where they could be raised proper, and she had been pressing that conviction harder of late, because the ranch had been going so visibly to ruin that even Silas had half begun to believe she might be right. And then she came out one July afternoon and found the ranch transformed, found the garden green and the corrals mended and the boys clean and fed and filling out, found a scrubbed house full of good smells, found her dead daughter's kitchen gleaming and her dead daughter's picture back up on the shelf, and found at the stove the author of all this, a large, plain woman in an apron who was so obviously and completely the new heart of the household that Adeline Cobb understood at a glance that her long campaign to gather these boys into her own control had just been lost, and that it had been lost to a fat, hired cook of no family and no standing whatsoever, and everything ugly and frightened and grasping in the woman rose up at the sight. She was too well bred to be crude about it. That was the worst of it, the way she wrapped the knife in courtesy, exactly as the town women always did. She admired the clean house in a tone that made cleanliness sound suspicious. She praised the food in a way that suggested a woman who cooked that well was surely angling for something. And then she got Silas alone on the porch, or thought she did, not knowing that the kitchen window was open and Della could hear every word, and she went to work on him the way water goes to work on stone. I'm sure she's very capable, Silas. I'm sure she's a great help. But you must think of how it looks. A woman like that, living out here, no chaperone, you a widower, and the talk in town? Well, I won't repeat what they're saying. And the boys. Have you thought about the boys? What it does to a boy to be raised by, forgive me, by a woman of that class, that appearance? Clara would be mortified. Clara wanted those boys to be gentlemen. Do you imagine that person is teaching them to be gentlemen? I'm only thinking of the children, Silas. I'm only thinking of what my daughter would have wanted. let me take the three youngest, just for a while, just until you can find a more suitable arrangement, a proper wife from a good family. It's not too late for you to marry well even now. But not her, Silas, anyone but her. You cannot seriously mean to tie yourself and my grandsons to a woman like that. Della stood at the sink with her hands in the dishwater and listened to herself be dismantled, phrase by courteous phrase. And it was nothing she had not heard before, nothing the world had not been telling her since she was a girl, that a woman shaped like her was ashamed to be hidden, a joke, a thing of no account, unfit for love or standing or respectable society. She had armored herself against it long ago, but it landed differently now, because now she had something to lose. Now there were 5 boys and a table and a man's rough, kind voice saying, "Stay," and she found that the armor she had worn her whole life did not cover the places that had grown soft and hopeful these past months. And the old cruel words got through to the tender new places and hurt her in a way they had not been able to hurt her in years. She waited, with her hands in the cooling water, to hear what Silas Ford would say. She was braced for the worst. She had been braced for the worst her whole life, and the worst had a way of coming. What Silas said was not the worst. But it was not the best either, and the not best of it cut Della deeper than Adeline Cobb's silk-wrapped knives had managed to. What Silas said, after a long, terrible silence, in a low, troubled voice, was, "She's done nothing but good for this family, Adeline, nothing but good." And Della's heart leapt. And then he said, "But I'll think on what you've said. I owe Clara's memory that much. I'll think on it." And Adeline Cobb, who knew the sound of a battle half won when she heard it, pressed her advantage and said she would come back at month's end for his answer, and that she prayed he would do right by her daughter's sons, and she got into her fine buggy and drove away, leaving behind her, like a smell that would not air out of the house, the poison of the words, how it looks, and a more suitable arrangement, and anyone but her. Silas did not come in to supper that night. He stayed out with the cattle till full dark, and when he came in he was quiet, quieter than he had been in weeks, the old grief silence come back over him like weather. And he could not meet Della's eyes, and she understood, or thought she understood, exactly what it meant. It meant that Adeline Cobb had made him see her the way the world saw her. It meant that in the clear, cold light of his mother-in-law's disapproval, he had looked at Della Mercer and seen, for the first time, not the woman who had brought his family back to life, but the woman the town was laughing at. The unsuitable woman. The shame. The thing that a man of any standing would be embarrassed to tie himself to. She had felt this exact shift in people before, more times than she could count. The moment when they stopped seeing her and started seeing her size, and she had never once been wrong about it, and she was sure she was not wrong about it now. And the being sure was the worst pain she had known in years, worse than any of the old cruelties, because she had let herself hope. She had let herself soften. She had let herself begin to love not just the boys, but the man, the tired, kind, rough, grieving man, and now she was going to pay for that softness the way she had always known. Deep down, that softness would be paid for. She lay awake that night in the little room off the kitchen that Silas had built for her with his own hands, walls and a door and a real bed. More than any of her other places had ever given her, and she did the arithmetic of it, the cold arithmetic she had done in 100 other houses at 100 other midnights when it came time to move on. And every way she added it up, it came to the same sum. If she stayed, she would cost these boys their grandmother, their good name in the town. Their chance at the respectable future Clara had wanted for them. She would cost Silas his standing and his peace, and maybe, if Adeline Cobb was as vengeful as she seemed, worse than that, for a woman of means could make a great deal of trouble for a man if she set her mind to it, could whisper to the church and the bank and the law until a struggling rancher found every door in the county closed to him. Della had brought light into this house, yes, but she saw now that the light came at a price the family could not afford, and that the most loving thing she could do, the last and hardest gift she could give the people she had come to love, was to take herself and her shameful, unsuitable body out of their lives before her presence in it cost them everything. She had done it before. She knew how to do it quietly. She would leave a full pantry and a clean house and a note, and she would be gone on the next freight wagon, and they would be sad for a while, and then they would heal, and Silas would marry some suitable, slender woman from a good family, and the boys would grow up gentlemen, and it would be as though Della Mercer had never passed through their lives at all, except for the ache of her going. It was the right thing. She was almost sure it was the right thing. She cried into her pillow so the sound would not carry, the way she had taught herself to cry a long time ago, and toward morning she slept a little, and when she woke, she began, quietly, to pack. But she had reckoned without Levi. She had reckoned without the eldest boy, the hard one, the one she had reached through his mother's picture and no further, the one she believed still held himself apart from her in the cold. She did not know that Levi had been watching her these weeks with different eyes than she imagined, that behind the cold mask the boy had been slowly, grudgingly, against his own fierce will, coming to love her and hating himself for it, and loving her anyway. She did not know that Levi, too, had been at that open window that afternoon, that he had heard his grandmother call Della a woman of that class, that appearance, and had heard his father say, "Only I'll think on it," and that something in the boy had broken loose at the sound of it, some last binding come undone. And so when Levi came down before dawn to start the stove, as was still his habit even now, and found Della in the kitchen with her carpet-bag packed and her shawl on and a note in her hand, he understood at once what was happening, and he did a thing that astonished them both. He put his back against the kitchen door, this near-grown boy, this 15-year-old who had held his grief against her like a shield for 3 months, put his body between Della Mercer and the door, and he said, in a voice shaking with everything he had not let himself say, "No, you're not going. I won't let you. You put your bag down." And when Della, gently, her own eyes filling, told him that she had to, that it was for their own good, that his grandmother was right, and her staying would cost them all too dear, Levi Ford began to cry. This boy who she had never once seen cry, the tears coming up out of some deep place he'd kept sealed for 5 years. And he said the thing that broke the whole story open. "I remember her," he said. "That's why. I'm the only one who really remembers her. Mama's the only. I remember what it was like. I remember the suppers and the singing and the way the house felt. And then she died and it all went away, and I've spent 5 years trying to hold it, trying to be the mama and the papa and everything, and I couldn't. I was 10. I couldn't do it. And everything just kept getting worse and worse, and I couldn't stop it. And then you came. And you made it feel like that again, like it felt when she was alive. And I hated you for it. I hated you because it felt like her, and you're not her, and it felt like forgetting her to let it feel good again." He scrubbed at his face furiously, a boy ashamed of his own tears. but I don't want you to go. I don't want it to go back to how it was. Please, Asa doesn't even remember, Mama. You're the only Mama he's ever going to get, and Gideon's getting mean like I was, and you're the only one who can calm him, and I can't do it alone again. I can't. Don't make me do it alone again. Please don't go. Please, the commotion woke the house. Della, weeping now herself, had just gotten down on her knees to gather the sobbing Levi into her arms. This great grieving boy who had held the family together alone and could not do it one more day. When she became aware that the others were there, that the younger boys had crept down the ladder in their nightshirts drawn by the sound, Asa knuckling his eyes, Gideon and Micah and Wesley standing in a frightened huddle, and that behind them, filling the doorway in his shirt sleeves with his face gone white, stood Silas Ford. He had heard. He had heard his eldest son beg the woman not to go, heard the boy say, I can't do it alone again, heard the whole broken truth of what these 5 years had cost the child who had shouldered them. And Silas Ford came into that kitchen, and his face was a terrible thing to see, and Della braced herself, still on her knees on the floor with Levi in her arms, braced for him to be relieved that the unsuitable woman was leaving and saving him the choice. Instead, he crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, and he dropped to his knees on the floor in front of her, this tall, proud, tired man, down on the floor so that his face was level with hers, and he took the note out of her hand, and he did not even read it. He crushed it in his fist, and he said, You were leaving. In the dark, without a word, because of what that woman said to me on the porch. It was not a question. His voice was shaking. Della, look at me. What I said to Adeline, I'll think on it. Do you know why I said that? Do you know why I couldn't say what I should have said, which was, get off my land and never speak of my Della that way again? She shook her head, because she did not know, because she had been so sure she knew, and now his face was telling her she had known nothing at all. Because she'd already said the thing I was most afraid of, Silas said. Not about how you look. God, Della, do you think I care one whit how you look? I stopped seeing you as anything but the finest woman I ever knew somewhere back in May, and I haven't seen you any other way since. No, she said, marry well, it's not too late, a proper wife. She said the word wife, Della, and it went through me like a knife. Because I'd been lying awake every night for a month wanting to make you my wife and not letting myself even think the word. And when she said it out loud, I panicked. I ran. I went cold, the way I go cold. Because, and here the great grief that was the root of all of it finally came up out of Silas Ford, the thing he had never once said aloud in 5 years. Because I loved a woman once, and I brought her out to this hard country against her own mother's wishes, and I got her with child, and the child came wrong, and I couldn't save her. I watched her die. And I swore over her grave I would never love another living soul that way again, because I could not survive burying another one. And then you walked up my road off a freight wagon, and I fell in love with you anyway. Without meaning to, without wanting to. And it terrified me, Della. It terrified me so bad that when Adeline handed me a reason to push you away, I near took it. Not because you're not good enough, because you're everything, and I am a coward about loving things I'm afraid to lose. The kitchen was dead silent when he finished. Silent but for the ticking of the stove and the small sound of Asa's sniffling. And Della Mercer knelt on the floor of that kitchen with one arm still around the eldest boy, and looked at the man kneeling in front of her, this man who had just laid the whole of his broken, frightened heart out on the floor between them. and she understood that everything she had been so sure of in the long, dark night had been wrong, wrong from the root, that the story she had told herself. The old story, the only story she knew, the one where she was ashamed to be hidden and love was a thing that happened to other women, had blinded her to the plain truth that was kneeling right in front of her with tears in its beard. He was not ashamed of her. He was afraid of losing her. Those are opposite things. It had taken her 34 years and a house full of motherless boys and a man on his knees on a kitchen floor before dawn to learn the difference, but she learned it in that moment all at once, and it remade her. Silas Ford, she said, and her voice was not steady, and she did not try to make it steady. You listen to me now, because I'm only going to say this the once, and then I'm going to get up off this floor and make breakfast, because these boys are going to be hungry, and I have never once in my life let a hungry child go unfed, and I'm not starting today. She reached out with her free hand, and she laid it against the side of his wet face, and he leaned into it, this proud man, leaned his whole weary head into her broad, plain hand. I have spent my whole life, she said, being looked past, being the woman nobody wanted, the joke, the help, the one who cooks the wedding supper and goes home alone. I made my peace with it a long time ago, or I told myself I did. And then I came up your road, and 5 boys and 1 broken-down cowboy went and made me forget my peace, made me want things I'd sworn off wanting, and last night I near left rather than lose them slow, because losing slow is the only kind of losing I couldn't bear. So you're afraid of loving something you might lose. Silas, so am I. So is everybody who ever loved anybody. That's not a reason to run from it. That's just the price of it, and it's worth the price. It's the only thing that ever is. I'm not your Clara. I'll never be your Clara, and I'd never try to be, and her picture's staying up on that shelf till the day I die, because those boys deserve to know the woman who gave them life. But I can be your Della, if you'll have me. Not as a cook. You know that's not what I'm saying. As a wife, I'm too old and too plain and too big to be anybody's blushing bride, but I've got a heart the size of the rest of me. And it's yours. It's been yours since about the 2nd week. And if you want it, you can have it. And if you're too scared to take it, then help me up off this floor anyway, because my knees aren't what they were, and I've got 12 eggs to fry. And Silas Ford laughed. It came up out of him rusty and disbelieving, and then full and real, the first true laugh those boys had heard from their father in 5 years, and he took her hand off his face, and he kissed the broad plain palm of it, and he said, "Marry me." Not because the boys need a mother, though God knows they do, and not because I need a cook, though God knows I need that too. Marry me because I love you, Della Mercer, every generous inch of you. And I have been the loneliest man in Montana for 5 years, and you walked in and lit the whole place up like a lamp, and I want to spend whatever the good Lord gives me being warm in your light. Marry me, please. And around them the 5 boys had begun to make a joyful racket, Asa jumping up and down, Wesley whooping, even Gideon grinning, and Levi, still in the circle of Della's arm, had gone quiet and wet-faced and was looking at his father and at Della with an expression of such raw relief that it was almost too much to look at, the look of a boy finally allowed to set down a weight he had carried alone for 5 years. And Della Mercer, kneeling on a kitchen floor at dawn with a near-grown boy in one arm and a good man kissing her hand and 5 children whooping around her, Della Mercer, who had come up that road with $11 and no expectation of ever being wanted by anyone, said yes. She made the breakfast. Of course she made the breakfast. 12 eggs and a skillet of fried potatoes and biscuits and the last of the ham. And they ate it all crowded around the table in the gray gold dawn light with everybody talking at once, and it was, Silas said, looking around at his noisy, joyful sons and the woman who had given them back to him, the finest breakfast of his life. And Della said that was only because he'd been eating his own cooking for 5 years, and any breakfast that didn't taste of scorched despair would. Seem a wonder. And the boys laughed, and Silas laughed, and even the memory of Adeline Cobb's coming visit could not dim it, though it sat there at the edge of the day like a cloud on the horizon that everyone could see and no one wanted to name. Because she was coming. She had said she would come at month's end for his answer, and month's end was 4 days off, and they all knew that Adeline Cobb was not a woman to accept the answer they meant to give her and go quietly home. Silas wanted to ride into town and have it out with her before she came, but Della said no. Della said, let her come. Let her come and say her piece in front of all of us, and let her hear our answer with the boys standing right there, because this is their family she means to break apart, and they've a right to stand up in it. And Silas, who was learning to trust that this woman understood the human heart better than he ever would, agreed. Adeline Cobb came at month's end in her fine black buggy. Dressed for a funeral or a victory, she likely was not sure herself which, and she found the whole family waiting for her on the porch of a ranch that had never in its life looked so well. The house painted where Silas and the boys had found time to paint it, the garden heavy with midsummer, the corrals full and mended. 5 clean, well-fed boys lined up on the porch steps, and at the top of them Silas Ford, with his arm, openly, unashamed, around the waist of the large woman in the good dress, and Adeline Cobb climbed down from her buggy and looked at that tableau, and knew, Della saw, knew before a word was spoken, that she had lost, and could not make herself accept it, and so reached, as frightened, grasping people always do, for the cruelest weapon in her hand. So, she said, you've made your choice. Well, I had hoped you would think of my grandsons before yourself, Silas, but I see the arrangement suits you. I'll say only this, and then I'll trouble you no further. I came prepared to offer those 3 youngest boys a home, a proper home, with means, with standing, with every advantage, schooling, society, a future, everything my Clara would have wanted for them, and everything they will never, ever have out here in the dirt with a—" and her eyes went to Della, and the old venom came up with a common hired woman playing at being their mother. I can give them the world. What can she give them? Ask yourself that, Silas, before you throw away my daughter's son's one chance at a decent life. What can that woman possibly give my grandchildren that would be worth more than everything I am offering? And before Silas could answer, before Della could, it was Levi who stepped forward. Levi, the eldest, the one Adeline had known longest and counted on most, her first grandson, near a man now. He came down one step toward his grandmother, and he said, in a voice that had stopped shaking, a voice that had found its feet, she gives us suppers, grandmother, hot ones, every night. The boy's plain words fell into the morning like stones into a well. She gives us clean clothes, and she doctors us when we're sick, and she taught Micah his letters, and she calms Gideon down when the temper takes him, and she reads to Asa till he sleeps, because Asa gets scared in the dark. And none of us knew that Asa got scared in the dark. In 5 years, none of us knew it, but she knew it in a week. You want to know what she gives us that's worth more than your money?" And Levi's voice broke, but he did not stop. "She gives us a mama. We had one. She died. You couldn't stop it, and Papa couldn't stop it, and I sure couldn't, and it about killed all of us. And then God sent us another one, up the road on a freight wagon. And I don't care that she's poor, and I don't care what she looks like, and I don't care what the town says. She is the best thing that ever happened to this family, and if you make Papa send her away, I will hate you for it every day until I die. So, don't. Please don't, Grandmother. Come to the wedding instead. Please come to the wedding." Something happened in Adeline Cobb's face then. It is a hard thing to watch a proud person's certainty crack, and Della, who had every reason in the world to enjoy the woman's defeat, found that she did not enjoy it at all, found instead that she pitied her. This lonely, frightened grandmother, who had loved her daughter and lost her, and had been trying ever since to buy back some piece of her through the grandchildren, and had gone about it so wrongly, with money and control instead of the one thing children actually need, which cannot be bought, and which Adeline had perhaps never in her life learned how to give freely. The old woman looked at her grandson, at Levi, at the tears standing in his eyes and the fierce love in his broken voice, and whatever hard thing she had come prepared to say died in her throat. She stood there in the summer morning a long moment. And then Adeline Cobb, to her lasting credit, did the bravest thing Della ever saw her do, which was to change. Her chin trembled. "He's grown so tall," she said, to no one, to herself, looking at Levi. Clara would. She would hardly know him. And then to Della, stiffly, with the enormous effort of a proud woman bending a spine that had not bent in decades, "You appear to have done well by them. Better than I. I did not think it possible that anyone could." She swallowed. "I should like to come to the wedding, if I am welcome. I find I do not want to lose them too. I have lost enough." And Della Mercer, who understood loss, who understood the loneliness that curdles into cruelty when it has nowhere kind to go, stepped down off that porch and crossed the yard to the stiff, proud, grieving old woman, and did the thing that no one expected, least of all Adeline. She took her hands. "You're welcome," she said. "You are their grandmother. You'll always be their grandmother and their mama's mama. And there's a place at my table for you any day you care to fill it, and I mean that. I don't say things I don't mean. Come to the wedding. Come to Sunday dinners. Teach these wild boys the gentleman manners I don't know the first thing about, because heaven knows somebody ought to, and it won't be me. We don't have to be enemies, you and I. We both love the same 5 boys. That's not a thing to fight over, that's a thing to share." And Adeline Cobb, who had come to break a family and been broken open herself instead, gripped the plain, strong hands of the woman she had despised, and wept, and was, from that day, though it took her a while to learn the way of it, a part of the family instead of a threat to it. Grief had made her hard. It was love, in the end, freely offered by a woman with no reason to offer it. That made her soft again. That was Della's last and quietest miracle in that season of miracles, and in some ways it was the greatest. For anyone can love the lovable, but it takes a particular largeness of heart to love the one who came to do you harm. They were married 3 weeks later, in the little church in Miller's Bend, and a whole town came. The same town that had laughed at the notice in the mercantile window and whispered about the fat cook the widower Ford had taken up with. They came to gawk, some of them, and they stayed to weep, because there is nothing on this earth that silences a mocking tongue like the sight of real love plainly shown. And the love between Silas Ford and Della Mercer was as plain and as real as bread. She wore a dress of soft gray blue that the boys had pooled their small savings to buy the cloth for, and Adeline Cobb herself had sewn. Her stitches small and perfect, and made, at last, with love. Asa carried the ring on a pillow and dropped it twice. Levi stood up as his father's best man, tall and grave and proud. And when the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married, it was all 5 boys who answered, together, "We do," in 5 voices from 5 throats, and there was not a dry eye in the church. And when Silas kissed his bride, plain and unashamed in front of the whole town, the same town that had laughed, the boys set up such a whooping and hollering that the preacher gave up trying to finish and just laughed along with everyone else. The marriage that followed was not at first an easy one, because no marriage is, and because both of them had spent so long alone and armored that learning to be soft with another person did not come natural to either. There were things to work out. There was Silas's grief, which did not vanish on the wedding day but went on being grief, quieter now, folded into the life instead of ruling it. And there were nights he woke from dreams of the snow and the blood and the doctor who came too late, and Della learned to wake with him and hold him in the dark and say nothing, only be there, warm and solid and living until the shaking passed. And there was Della's own deep wound, the one the world had spent 34 years grinding into her. The bone-deep conviction that she was not truly wanted, that she was tolerated, useful, a convenience a man had settled for, and that any day now Silas would wake up and see her the way the world saw her, and the love would curdle into disappointment. It did not curdle. That was the slow, astonishing lesson of her marriage. The thing she could scarcely make herself believe, even as it happened day after day after day. The love did not curdle. Silas Ford woke up every morning next to his large, plain wife and looked at her like she was the sunrise. And he did it the next morning, too, and the next. And the season turned and turned again, and still he looked at her that way, and slowly. The way ice goes out of the ground in spring, so slow you cannot see it happen, and then one day the ground is soft, the old wound in Della began to heal. He courted her, was the thing of it, courted her after the wedding the way most men court before, as though he were making up for all the courting she'd never had. He brought her the first wild roses of summer, laid them by her plate without a word. He learned she had never once in her life been given a present wrapped in paper, and he took to wrapping things in paper foolish small things, a hair comb, a bag of horehound candy, a length of ribbon, just to see her face when she untied the string, because she untied the string like it was the most precious thing anyone had ever handed her. And it was. It was. It was the wrapping that undid her every time, the sheer unimaginable luxury of being someone worth wrapping a present for. And she, who had never been beautiful a day in her life, came, under the long, steady warmth of that man's devotion, to feel beautiful, which is a different thing than being it and a better one, and the boys noticed the change in her, though they could not have named it. Noticed that Della sang now while she cooked, sang out full and unashamed in a fine, strong voice none of them had known she had. And a house where the mother sings is a house that is healed, and the Ford house had healed all the way through. The town came around, as towns do, won over first by the wedding, and then, more lastingly, by the simple, relentless goodness of the woman. For Della did with the whole of Miller's Bend what she had done with the Ford family, which was defeated. She was known within a year as the finest cook in the county, and her table became a kind of institution, for she could not for the life of her cook a small amount, and there was always too much, and the too much found its way to whoever needed it. The sick and the poor and the newly widowed and the young mothers worn to the bone, a basket left on a porch, a pie carried to a funeral, a standing invitation to any hungry soul that Sunday dinner at the Ford Ranch was open to all comers and always would be. And the town that had laughed at the fat cook came to understand that it had been given something rare in its midst. A genuinely large heart in a genuinely large body, and to be ashamed of its early laughter, and to love her, in the end, near as much as her own family did. The women who had whispered brought their daughters to learn bread making at her elbow. The men who had smirked tipped their hats to her in the street. It did not happen fast, but it happened the way all her miracles happened, one meal and one kindness and one stubborn refusal to grow bitter at a time. There was in the second year a baby, a girl, the first daughter in that house full of men, and they named her Clara, all of them agreeing on it without any need to discuss it, Clara for the mother who had gone and whose picture still watched over the kitchen, and Della raised that little girl as she raised everything, with an open hand and a full table and a heart that had room in it for one more. Always one more. And the strangest, sweetest thing, the thing Della marveled at all her days, was that having a child of her own body did not make her love the 5 boys one whit less or differently. That love turned out not to be a pie that got smaller the more you cut it, but a stranger substance that only grew the more of it you gave away. So that little Clara's coming did not divide the family's love, but multiplied it, and the boys doted on their baby sister, and Levi, the eldest, the hard one, the one who had blocked the door, held that infant girl with a tenderness that made Della have to leave the room to cry, where he would not see. The boys grew, as boys do, too fast. The way the good years always go too fast. Levi grew into a fine, stutty man, married a Miller's Bend girl, and took over more and more of the ranch as Silas's hair went white, and named his own first son Silas, and his second, quietly, to no one's surprise and everyone's tears, he named after no dead grandmother at all, but after Della, a boy named for the woman who was no bloodkin to him and was the truest mother he had ever known. Wesley went for a lawyer. His quick, clever tongue put at last to good use, and never lost the gift of making his mother laugh. Micah, who had nursed the broken-winged hawk behind the stove, became the kind of rancher animals trusted, and stayed on the home place all his life. Gideon, whose temper Della had walled against so patiently, grew into the gentlest of them all, as the fierce ones sometimes do once someone has loved them through the fire. And Asa, the baby, the 5-year-old who had put his arms around her broad middle and said, "You feel like a mama," Asa never in his whole life called her anything but mama, having never known another. And when he was grown and someone asked him once about his mother, he spoke of Della with such love that the person was astonished to learn, later, that she had not borne him, and Asa, when he heard they'd been surprised, only said, "She raised me. She fed me. She loved me every day of my life. What else would you call that but my mother?" Della Mercer Ford lived to be an old, old woman, old and broad and white-haired and beloved, surrounded to the end by the enormous family that had grown up out of one desperate notice in a mercantile window and one supper cooked by a woman with $11 and nowhere else to go. And sometimes, in her last years, she would sit in the evening in her chair by the stove, Under the picture of Clara that still hung on the shelf, with the noise of children and grandchildren filling the house around her, and she would think back to the gray morning she had stood in front of that yellowed notice and made herself hope, one more time, against all the evidence of her life, that a door might open instead of closing. And she would think of the woman she had been, weary and unwanted and down to her last dollars, so certain that the road held nothing for her but more of the same cold passing over she had always known. And she wished, as she had wished once before about another woman on another hard road, that she could go back and lay a hand on that frightened woman's shoulder and tell her the truth she could not have believed. Keep walking, she would tell her. Keep walking up that road. There are 5 boys at the end of it who are going to look at you and see a mother, and a broken man who is going to look at you and see the sun, and a whole life of being wanted so much and so daily that you will forget you ever doubted it. Everything you stopped letting yourself want is waiting for you at the top of that road. Just keep walking. Just knock on the door. For Della Mercer, who had cooked 1,000 suppers in other people's kitchens and gone home alone from every one of them, had cooked one supper at last in a kitchen that became her own, and that one supper had changed a widower's life and 5 boys' lives, and most of all, and least expected, her own. She had come up that road with nothing, wanted by no one. Sure, she was fit only to serve and never to be served, to feed love and never to be fed it. And she had found, at the top of that long road, in a ruined kitchen full of hungry, motherless boys, the one thing she had never once let herself believe was meant for a woman like her. She had found a family that was hers. She had found a man who saw all of her and turned away from none of it. She had found the one place in all the wide, hard world she was always meant to be. This was home. And she had stayed.